Okay, we're back. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay. So essentially, we're looking at different components of the implementation process, and I know for a fact that civil society was not directly involved in the interim government. From what I remember from the power sharing government, it was purely political parties, namely ANC, NP, and IFP. That's correct, right?
Well, there were other parties. There was the Democratic Alliance. There were other parties that were formed. So, in fact, the multi-party negotiation forum that negotiated the interim constitution actually consisted of quite a number of political parties.
But that's the negotiations. I'm particularly looking at
the interim government. Yes,
exactly.
Okay.
Yeah. And that was only those three parties, right? So I'm focused, and DP was not part of that. Of course, they played a role then in the parliamentary process, and
in the Constitutional Assembly, yes.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's the next point I'm particularly interested in. Could you explain the role of civil society and and other parties in the development of the final constitution that took place, in the Constitutional Assembly?
Okay. Well, the Constitutional Assembly consisted of the National Assembly and the Senate. So, I mean, it was a constitutional structure, and its role was to establish a final constitution. And as I understood it, the mechanism by which this was produced was for it to have its own deliberations, but as a broad principle, in fact, established by way of a very important decision taken around September, the principle of consultation was quite paramount. And so they went out and consulted quite widely across the countries, establishing different fora to solicit the views of both civil society organizations and also individuals, citizens. So a kind of two-pronged approach. And out of these, they elicited views on a range of issues that then were taken into account when they, as the constitutional body, drew up the constitution.
Okay. Elaborate a bit on those consultations. Those are very interesting.
Right. So just firstly to situate myself in the process and kind of agency I had around them. I must say that at the time I was very much directly involved in the discussions around the chapter on the security services, what was to be the chapter on the security services in the Constitution. And this was a rather closed process in some respects, happening under the auspices of a forum which drew together, or various fora which drew together precisely the armed groups, as you've put it. Our main point of interaction were academics who were interested in security studies, civil society organs like the Institute for Security Study, it was the IDP at the time, the Institute for Multi-Party Democracy, which had an interest in establishing multi-party oversight mechanisms. So a rather specific focus on the kinds of institutions were drawn into that process. I'm just mentioning this because it was a process that, in my experience, although it sort of was leading into this, was somewhat separate from the broader process which the Constitutional Assembly was driving, which was a much more public and transparent process. And so I wasn't at all involved in that other much broader process, which and I have to be very declaratory here, from the reading I have done and my just browsing through different publications of that time, involved actually going from province to province. This is the MPs or the members of the Constituent Assembly now. They had some secretariat, as I understand it, or they'd outsourced it to. They had an office which actually set this out, and which then basically got people together in community halls, in workshop formats to discuss what they were there about. So that was the kind of outreach, but at the same time, people were simply writing in and expressing their views on a range of issues. I can refer you to a book which I've got before me, which I found very interesting. It was produced by the Institute for Global Dialogue, and it's called Public Participation in South African Constitution Making Process. Most of their stuff is online, so it's quite possible that this one will be online as well. I just haven't been able to check that. I can send you the details if you like.
I wrote it down, so I'm sure I will find it.
Okay.
By the Global Institute for Global Dialogue.
Yeah. Okay. The author is Sinov Skelton. I can spell that out, let me just spell it out. Synove, first name.
Okay.
And the surname Skjelten.
Okay.
Yep.
I'm sure I'll find that.
Okay, yeah.
Okay, I will have to look into that in more detail. And so essentially it were the MPs who would have consultations in the respective constituencies.
Well, not necessarily their respective constituencies, because with the proportional representation system that we don't have a constituency model, but they were sort of sent out, it would seem. And I don't know the details, so I don't want to second guess how they organized themselves to go out and do this outreach. But yes, they went and, I think, they really tried to reach out to the rural areas. So by that I mean the Eastern Cape, the KwaZulu-Natal, the Limpopo areas, places which would normally not have been privileged in consultation processes.
Yeah, and probably had been left out during the constitutional negotiations leading to the interim constitution.
Yeah, well, in a sense, because I think that most of the political party representatives were urban-based. It was largely, people who would have been. Yes, the political party structures are not so. I don't know if that was a rationale, but it was quite interesting that they made a particular effort to reach out to people in more rural areas during this phase of the process.
Okay. Then you mentioned security sector transformation, which is not a major implementation mechanism or component of implementation processes that we consider. Could you elaborate to what extent and in which ways civil society was involved in the security sector transformation after 1994, and what influence civil society had on that process?
I think that, like I said, the parties to the conflicts were directly involved. there was an effort to reach out to them. As you know, the Defense Review, which began in 1996, was quite an extensive one.